talking about truths that we need to center upon to be able to live lives that are balanced, that are in tune. In our discussion thus far about being centered, we've talked about the fact that there is a certain truth about truth that we need to understand. We've talked about the fact that we need to be centered on certainties, the certainties that God provided. Last week we talked about faithfulness, and we identified that faithfulness is a marathon. And the scripture reading that was read for us from the Gospel of Luke makes that very plain. Jesus makes it very understandable that to begin this thing with him, one has to complete it. And so if you set your hand to the plow, but then you look back, then you have regrets, then you stop serving in faithfulness, that's not acceptable. So we're talking about a marathon. We're not talking about a sprint. We're not talking about beginning with a flash. We're talking about the long haul. We're talking about the book of Revelation, chapter 2 and verse 10. We're talking about being faithful until death. I love the way that Paul expresses to Timothy his own fight for faithfulness. He says, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race, and I've kept the faith. In the future there is reserved for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me on that day, and not only me, but all those who have loved his appearing. I'm racing to the end, and I can see the prize. Last week we covered 2 points. The first one is that faith is very fragile. In other words, because it's a long haul, we need to be aware that we can drop faith quickly. We can grow weary of the race. We looked at the fact that at points in time in history, faith was difficult to find. God found it difficult to find faith in the Old Testament. Jesus, when he arrived on the face of the earth, found it difficult to find faith. The New Testament writers wrote repeatedly about how faith could be lost and how those who were living by faith needed to walk in faith. They needed to keep that faith until the very end. This passage in Proverbs expresses it all very well. Many a man proclaims his steadfast love, but a faithful man who can find? The righteous who walks in integrity, blessed are his children after him. Where can we find the faithful man? It's a marathon. It's fragile. It can be lost quickly. One of the things that make it so fragile is that faith can also have elements of fraudulence about it. We can convince ourselves that we are walking in faith when in actuality we may not be there. When we think about that, it's often because we've misunderstood, we've incorrectly defined, or we've worked it to develop a counterfeit form of faithfulness. Faithfulness is not perfection. It's not practicing a predetermined list of spiritual values, morals, or doctrines. Faithfulness is an intention of heart. It is a process. And we have to continually recognize that. And if we don't, we can rest in fraudulent things. You remember in Jeremiah chapter 7, Jeremiah stands at the gate of the temple and he warns those who enter. He says, beware those of you that come to the temple saying, this is the temple of God, this is the temple of God. They were trusting in things, and then he talks about them shedding innocent blood, they're backbiters, they're doing all this stuff that is ungodly, but they walk into to God's temple and say, look what I am. Well, you see how easy it is to develop this fraudulent nature of faith. Faithfulness is the condition of the heart which pumps confidence and conviction in God's ability to the smallest capillaries of one's spiritual body. While faith produces a variety of activities and works, it precedes those efforts and not vice versa. In other words, faith is something that is a predetermined nature of my heart which leads me to certain activities. Doing the activities does not necessarily mean I have faith. For example, you remember how James put this? You see that his faith, speaking about Abraham, and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. Works, activity, actions are the completion of faith. They are the elements of faith that are visible. But faith must precede those things. Faith is an issue of the heart. It's a conviction and commitment in God's ability, and we live by that faith. I announced last week that we were going to talk today about fortifying faithfulness. Talk about 5 things that we can engage in because faith is difficult, it is fraudulent, it is fragile. We need to, all of us, be so guarded about our own faith. Less concerned about the faith of others and more concerned about ours. And so this morning, introspectively, I want to challenge you to look at 5 things about your faith. And the first one is this. If we're going to maintain faith, we must keep God as a number one priority. We must keep God as a number one priority. Matthew chapter 6, Jesus says, "But seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things will be provided for you." We can discuss, we can debate how those things get provided. But what we cannot miss in the teaching of Jesus is He said what we need to seek first is God's kingdom. And if we seek first that kingdom of God, He says God will provide for us. Do you want to feast at God's table of blessing, watchfulness, and protection? Here's what Jesus said needs to be priority if I'm going to accomplish that. At the time of the banquet, He sent His slave to tell those who were invited, "Come, because everything is ready." But without exception, they all began to make excuses. The one said to Him, "I've bought a field, and I must go out and see it. I ask you to excuse me." Another one said, "I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I'm going to try them out. I ask you to excuse me." And another one said, "I just got married, and therefore I'm unable to come. For I tell you," verse 24 says, "not one of those men who were invited will enjoy my banquet." We want to feast at the banquet of faithfulness. We need to recognize that God's got to be first. You know, there's a reason Jesus told that story, that parable. And it's because it's too easy for us to let God not be our priority. There are so many things vying for first place in every one of our lives that God can easily be bumped out. For example, first one says, "I bought a field." What would people bought a field for in those days? Well, I suppose the same reason they'd buy a field today. It'd be to make a living, raise a crop, have animals. It was a form, if you will, of security. It was a form of making it on your own. It was the ability to be self-providing. And so, invited to the Master's banquet of faith, it is so easy for us to say, "You know what? Excuse me, because I need something else for my security. I have to do something else. My security demands more. So please excuse me from your feast." The second man says, "I bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I need to go try them out. I've got something else I need to do. Okay, I know I've been invited to make God the primary person in my life by this banquet of faithfulness, but you know, I've just got something else that I need to do. I've just invested something, I've just purchased, I need to go try these animals out, make sure that everything is kosher, that it's all going to work. I have something else to experience. So how can I make God priority? Because I really have to experience this myself. I have something else I have to do. So please excuse me from your banquet." And then the last one says, "I've married a wife." All the men are saying, "Well, that one makes sense." No. You see, now what's happening is this person is saying, "I've got something else good to do." You see, this isn't bad. This isn't seeking false security. This isn't, I want to experience, I want to have the joy of something else. This is, I've got another good thing that I need to tend to. Having a wife's a good thing. Being married's a good thing. But you know what? We can negate our faith by doing good things instead of making God number one. There's a lot of good things in this world. We engage in a lot of good things. But we can still excuse ourselves from putting God first. The second habit that I think will help us maintain faithfulness is we need alone time with God. We need alone time with God. If we're going to make Him priority, we've got to have time with Him. Now, we started the year talking about prayer, and that definitely is one of the ways we spend time alone with God. We also just spend time alone with God in meditation and thought. We spend time alone with God in His Word. We do any number of things, but we need to have alone time with God. The psalmist expressed it so powerfully. God, you are my God. I eagerly seek you. I thirst for you. My body faints for you in a land that is dry, desolate, and without water. So I gaze on you in the sanctuary to see your strength and your glory. My lips will glorify you because your faithful love is better than life. So I praise you as long as I live. At your name, I will lift up my hands. You satisfy me with rich food. My mouth will praise you with joyful lips. When on my bed I think of you, I meditate on you during the night watches. Because you are my help, I will rejoice in the shadow of your wings. I follow close to you. Your right hand holds on to me. If we're going to keep our faith, we've got to spend alone time with God. It can come on our bed in the middle of the night. It comes during the daytime. It develops that feeling that I am constantly under the wing of God's care, that He constantly has hold of my hand. That only comes when we spend alone time with Him. You know, even God's Son illustrates the necessity of alone time with the Father. Early on in His ministry, Jesus came to the city of Capernaum, where Peter's mother-in-law was ill. He heals her. As a result, probably, of that healing, the word spreads, and all of a sudden, by the middle of the day, hundreds of people are being brought to the house to be healed. And Jesus is there, and the whole town is assembled at the door, and He's healing all of these people. And this is just, you would think, wow, what a great opportunity. You know, here all these people are ready to hear what Jesus has to say. But here's what the text says. He healed many who were sick with various diseases and drove out many demons, but He would not permit the demons to speak because they knew Him. That's what happens at the end of that day. Then we read the next morning, very early in the morning, while it was still dark, He got up, went out, and made His way to a desert place, and He was praying there. Peter and some of the other apostles come and find Him. And they say, hey, everybody in town's looking for you. Remember what Jesus says? Let's move on. Why did He come to that conclusion? Because He'd made time with God a priority. Were there not people still in need? Yeah, there were. But apparently there was something of greater need. But He only understood that because He had alone time with God. Here's a easy little poem about how important it is to be alone with God. In silence at the close of day, when sun and light have gone away, I kneel in solitude to pray, alone with God. When sad, I count my every care and all the grief that I must bear, and I close my eyes in peaceful prayer, alone with God. When triumph brings me joy anew, and I feel blessed in all I do, I ne'er forget my rendezvous, alone with God. Through life, I always want to be a Christian of reality and keep that hour so dear to me, alone with God. God's got to be priority, and we've got to spend alone time with Him. The third habit I would suggest is we need to connect with other believers. The Church of Pentecost knew the importance of being devoted to a number of things. Wednesday night class a few weeks ago, we looked at that particular text and looked at the fact that devoted is a compound word. It comes from meaning toward or a direction, and strong, strength, and it implies a continuance. So in essence, the church of the day of Pentecost recognized their need to take a direction toward being strong, being connected, and enduring. That was what they devoted themselves to. They were devoted to continuing their faithful walk. So, what did they devote themselves to? The text says they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to breaking bread, and to prayers. Young's literal. And they were continuing steadfastly in the teaching of the apostles and the fellowship and the breaking of the bread and the prayers. The reason I show you the literal is because there isn't a good English translation of that verse other than that one. Because the definite article appears before every one of those activities in the original language. They were engaging in the apostles' teaching, in the fellowship, in the breaking of bread, and in the prayers. And that's significant because it accentuates and accents each of those activities as part of the means by which this body of believers was going to continually grow in their faith. It was their mutual connection that was going to aid in their spiritual understanding. They were going to get the apostles' teaching. They didn't have Bibles. They couldn't open up Scripture and study on their own. They came because they had to hear it. And so they came for the purpose of understanding, gaining spiritual understanding. Now we have Bibles and we think, I can read this on my own. I can go on the internet. I can hear people talk about this. Why do I need to come together? I'll tell you why you need to come together. Because it's in coming together that we gain spiritual understanding. I'm not talking about me explaining. I'm talking about what we just learned from each other. In Psalm 73, that's that psalm where Asaph says he's just about ready to slip from his faith. And then he says, until I came into the sanctuary of God. And then he will talk about what he learns from the assembly. You know where you need to be so that your faith remains strong? With other believers. Because it's in that environment that we have the blessing of gaining a spiritual understanding. Asaph would never have understood that had he been on his own, had he stayed on his own. He was distorted in his view of spiritual things. The evil people had no pain in death. They were growing fat in their wickedness. God didn't care. God wasn't punishing them. I have washed my hands in vain, he says. But until I came into the sanctuary of God and into the assembly, then I understood. Then I understood. Folks, this is a place of understanding. We gain mutual understanding. It's in mutual connection that we also experience the peaceful presence of Jesus. Jesus said, where two or three are gathered in my name, there I am also. In John chapter 20, he appears after his resurrection to all except one. And for a week, the other disciples attempt to convince Thomas that Jesus has been raised from the dead. As far as we know, Thomas never believed. And that's why we call him Doubting Thomas. A week later, they're back in the same room. Jesus comes into the room. Thomas is there. What does he say? My Lord and my God. Why? Because he experienced the peace of Jesus in that environment. This is an assembly of Jesus. He's head of his body, the church. And just like your body has aches and pains and things don't work quite right, there's people sitting in this room who are an ache and a pain and who don't work quite right. But that's no excuse to cut off the head. I'm not here today because I'm so good, and I'm not here today because you're so good. I'm here today because he's the head, and this is his body. And the first century church, the church in the day of Pentecost, experienced the peace of Jesus by coming together. We also find that there are just certain things that can't be done on our own. I mean, we just have to be collective to accomplish them. For example, it's real hard to give of your money if you're not in a place where you can give of your money. Now, I know you can send it, you can even get on the internet and send money. But you can't give to a specific purpose unless you're gathered with people. You can't lay by in store and then take up a collection unless you're with other people. That can't happen. You can't teach and admonish one another in song. You can sing on your own. I'm glad more people don't just walk in the office because they would oftentimes hear me singing on my own. But I cannot teach and admonish in song in my office. And neither can you. We've got to be together to accomplish that. So, mutual connection is a necessary element if we're going to maintain our faith. Connecting with others is actually the lab work, if you will, for every believer. You know how many things are taught to be Christian disciplines that we'll never learn unless we're with other people? You're never going to learn to forgive unless you're with people who need to be forgiven. You're never going to learn not to complain unless you're with people that you could complain about. We're never going to learn the realities of the spiritual walk until we're walking with spiritual people. This is the lab work, being apart. God's plan is that within the body function, we all grow to Him who is the head. And that's what he says in Ephesians chapter 4. He talks about the fact that He's put apostles and elders and teachers in the kingdom for the purpose of equipping people to use their gifts. And then he said the reason for all that is until we all attain to the unity, because every supporting ligament is being promoted and grows up itself in love. Each individual part has to do its part. You've all heard the illustration before. When a fire dies, guess what? Hot coals remain. But what happens when a coal gets separated? It gets cold and it grows useless. So what's the best place to fan your spiritual heart back into flame? It's not on your own. And you can sit there and say, well, you know, I don't see a lot of people on fire. Maybe not. But there's some coals. And where's the place where coals are going to want to fan themselves into fire? Yeah. Paul says, recalling your tears, I long to see you, so that I might be filled with joy. He's writing that about Timothy. And then he says, I have been reminded of your sincere what? Faith. What are we talking about? Being faithful. I've been reminded of your sincere faith, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded it now lives in you. For this reason I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God, which is in you through the laying out of my hands. You know what I want you to see there? Is that apparently flaming service appears to hold some kind of connection with others. Your sincere faith, which I am confident dwelt in your grandmother and in your mother, and I'm convinced it's in you, fan it into flame. Fanning ourselves into flame depends upon others. Gather with some coals. Let the wind blow. Let the Spirit move so that those coals can be fanned into flame. But that's where I want to be. That's where the faithful want to be. Number 4, find your means of serving. If you want to maintain your faith, you must find an avenue in which you can be of service. Growth in faithfulness parallels one's growth in spiritual service. It's vital, therefore, for everyone to continually find the gifts given them by God and the gifts added when those gifts are invested, and to use those. Sadly, many seem to know what their gifts are not. Others are so knowledgeable of what they are that they never look beyond them. You know, there's something in the truth that God has actually blessed faithful servants with additional abilities. That ought to lead us to continually search for new ways of serving. Matthew chapter 25. Jesus uses a parable. He says the master leaves and he gives one guy 5 talents. And what does the man with 5 talents do? He uses those 5 talents. He gives another man 3 talents. What's he do? He uses those talents. He gives a man 1 talent. What does he do? He buries it. He hides it. He comes back. The master returns. The guy he's given 5 to, he comes out and he says, Master, here's 5, and I've gained 5 more. What happens when we use what God has given us to serve? We gain. We gain more. I know, because it's my experience as well as it's yours, that we find a way that we feel comfortable serving God, and we serve. And then maybe age happens, things change, and all of a sudden that service is no longer required of us. Maybe we can't do that anymore. Maybe it's not needed anymore. And so we say, well, I've served. As we've been faithful in serving, God's been faithful in giving us new abilities to serve elsewhere and in other ways. That's what I appreciate so much about faithful Christians who, as they physically mature and cannot do physically what they at one time, they look for different ways that they can still serve. They find additional ways. And they dream up things I never would have thought of. Why? Because God blessed them with additional means, and because they want to keep their faith strong and growing, and so they find ways of serving. Peter puts it this way: based on the gift they have received, everyone should use it to serve others as good managers of the varied grace of God. God's given you a gift. He's given me a gift. And our blessing comes when we manage that gift and we serve others with that gift. Isaiah says, when I heard the voice, remember that whole vision in chapter 6, burning coals? It says, when I heard that voice of the Lord saying, who should I send? Who will go for us? I said, here am I, send me. Powerful passage, motivational passage. Dwight D. Moody wrote in the margin of his Bible next to that passage these words: I am only one, but I am one. I cannot do everything, but I can do something. What I can do, I ought to do. And what I ought to do, by the grace of God, I will do. Wow. You got room in your margin? That'd be worth writing there, wouldn't it? It's sad when church members seem to concentrate more on how the church should serve them than them serve. Nothing new, though. Our Savior had to contend with a group of followers more intent on being served up to the very end. So how faithful do we want to be? Lastly, one of the things that will help us maintain our faithfulness is to learn to tell our story. The word gospel means good news, right? Any number of ways we can reference it as good news. Good news because Jesus was raised from the dead. Good news because I can be saved from my sin. It's good news. And because it's good news, that should have some kind of an effect on every believer's life. We've been rescued from ourselves. That's good news. I've been redeemed from my wrongs. That's good news. I am righteous in the eyes of the Creator of all things. That's pretty good news. I am viewed as a reflection of His Son because I died with Him. That's good news. But it's when we forget to tell our story that we forfeit our faithfulness. When we forget that good news, we lose sight of the things that will keep us faithful. So it's important for us to repeat our story over and over so that we remember our purpose, so we remember His purpose, so we remember our servanthood to Him, our devotion to Him, our need, our desire to finish the race, to win the prize, our desire to hear the words, "Come, good and faithful servant." That's good news. We've got to tell our story. On one occasion, Jesus takes His disciples across the Sea of Galilee to the area of Decapolis, meaning 10 cities. Those 10 cities were all non-Jewish cities, and the Jews considered that to be the most evil place in the whole world. There's even some question about whether the disciples, when they arrived at the other shore, even got out of the boat. The text never says they did. Jesus did. So Jesus takes them to Decapolis, they land, and Jesus gets out of the boat, and all of a sudden he is met by this crazy dude living in the cemetery, naked. He's got broken chunks of chain wrapped around him, and Jesus casts the demons out of him into a herd of swine. The swine goes over into the sea. And before Jesus and the disciples leave, the man who had been demon-possessed kept begging him to be with him. But he would not let him. Instead, he told him, "Go back home to your own people and report to them how much the Lord has done for you and how He has had mercy on you." So he went out and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. And they were all amazed. You telling your story aids in developing your faithfulness. A sure way to grow weary in the race is to lose sight of what great things Jesus has done for you and fail to share that with other people. By the way, that all happens in Mark, the first chapter. In Mark chapter 7, Jesus comes back to the Decapolis. And that's the time when he begins to, I guess he initially heals a deaf man. And then Mark records, in those days, there was a great crowd. As far as we know, there's just one guy over there telling what Jesus has done for him. And the next time Jesus shows up, he gets a crowd. The first time, a whole village came out and said, get out of town. The second time he comes, there's a whole crowd comes and he feeds them. The difference, one person telling their story made. Folks, we need to tell our story. Wednesday night, we're going to be looking at the longest recorded sermon of Paul in Acts chapter 13. And part of what is said there, he's in the synagogue at Antioch, and here's the invitation. If you have any message of encouragement, you may speak. You know what our world is saying to us? Oh, we concentrate on how evil the world is and the influences that are around us and all of it. Our world is saying, if you have a word of encouragement, let me know. And all we have to do is tell our story. That's all we have to do. You want to be faithful till death? I want to be faithful till death. We're going to have to make God number one. We're going to have to spend time alone with him. We're going to have to connect with other believers. We're going to have to find our means of service. And we're going to need to tell our story. And those are the things that will get us to the point, like Paul, I've finished the race. I've kept the faith. There is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord will give, not only to me, but to all who have loved his appearing. Faithfulness till death. Introspectively, where's your faithfulness?